Welcome to another Puscast, a review of the infectious disease literature, this one covering the last 2 weeks of December in the year 2019. I'm recording this on January 1st, 2020, so it's also the first podcast of the new year. A happy new year to one and all. References, as always, are available at edgydoc.com, the home of my multimedia empire of books, podcasts, etc. Let's see if I can get all this done before the Rose Bowl is on. Go Ducks. First up, I'm always fascinated how my practice of infectious diseases seems different than the literature. This is a study about outpatient antibiotic therapy, OPAT, and what resulted in patient readmission while on home antibiotic therapy. And they found the one thing that was associated with decreasing risk of readmission was having a follow-up in the OPAT clinic. But what was amazing to me is that this study out of Emory had 18% of patients being readmitted while on outpatient antimicrobial therapy. I can't remember, and of course my memory is faulty, the last time I had a readmission to the hospital from the outpatient antibiotic clinic. Usually the thing that brings people in and admission is neutropenia from the antibiotics, and I see that about once every 5 years, I would imagine. I never get readmissions, and I only see patients on the last week of therapy as a rule to talk to them about what to look forward to and or transition them to oral therapy if needed. So I don't know what I'm doing right or what they're doing wrong, but I find it incredible that 1 out of 5 patients on home antibiotics gets readmitted. Although, as best I can glean from the study, it looks like the reason that patients were readmitted is they were sent out on the wrong antibiotics in the first place. This is only alluded to for enterococcal infections, and this was because there was a lack of ID consultation in the patients going home on IV antibiotics. Although I will admit I cannot glean in detail why patients were readmitted in this study. But a lack of ID consultation would be an excellent reason why patients would come back in the hospital. I have said this before, and I tend to repeat myself, but I sometimes wonder if antibiotics should not be more like anti-cancer drugs, and only people who know what they're doing be allowed to prescribe them. I mean, can you imagine if cancer was treated like infections? Ugh. You may not be aware of this, but the Saiga, S-A-I-G-A, antelope is an endangered species. In large part, it's due to hunting because parts of the animal are used in traditional Chinese pseudo-medicine. And a remarkable number of animals are going extinct not because of global warming, but because they're consumed for pseudo-medical nonsense. But they can add insult, or in this case, infection, to injury in that 2016-17, the Peste des Petites virus got introduced into Mongolia, and this has accelerated the deaths of these animals. The infection is also involving other ungulates, and as a result, there's been an 80% decline in the population of these animals. So many animals have zero future. I know that's not a human disease, but I still find the various infections around the world to be interesting. And you have to suffer with me. As we head into flu season, what have we learned from prior flu seasons? Is the effectiveness of the flu vaccine in mom to prevent influenza in baby? This study looked at 2 different flu seasons and found a 66% vaccine efficacy and a 50% vaccine efficacy in back-to-back flu years. So if you want to prevent flu in your baby, mom should get the flu vaccine. And vaccinating mom against flu was better preventing disease in the baby for H1N1 than it was for the circulating H3 that season. And what about COPD patients? Getting the influenza vaccine was associated with a decrease in both laboratory proven vaccine and influenza-associated hospitalization, with an effectiveness of about 22%. Not as good, but still better than nothing. I tend to think of the flu vaccine like seatbelts. They're not necessarily going to prevent me from being killed in a car accident, but I just as soon have seatbelts on when I have a car accident. It's all about playing the odds. And who should be tested for influenza in the ER? Well, there's a simple guideline. You give a point for a variety of symptoms. A new or increased cough is 2 points. A headache is 1 point. Subjective fever is 1 point. And a real fever is 1 point. And if you have a score of greater than equal to 3, you likely had influenza, or at least needed testing for influenza. And that test had a sensitivity and specificity of 94% and 36% respectively. One of the things I'm always amazed at this time of season is how many people with a symptom complex that apparently came out of a Nutramatic machine. It was something not entirely unlike influenza, yet the patient gets influenza testing. Flu is primarily a headache, coughing, myalgia, fever syndrome. And if you lack these symptoms, you likely lack influenza. But that doesn't stop testing from being done. And one of the reasons why the vaccine is not as effective as it should be is due to antigenic drift. Like human beings, influenza is a sloppy reproducer, and over time, the gradual accumulation of new amino acids in surface proteins changes the antigenicity of the virus. This does affect the vaccine, as shown in this study, where they looked at the strains that were circulating and the efficacy of the vaccine. And as the H3N2 shifted over to an H3N2 clad 3C.3a in the latter part of the influenza season, the vaccine became less effective. All the more reason we are in desperate need of a universal flu vaccine that targets parts of the virus that never change. Such a vaccine is in the works, and I hope it happens in my lifetime, which isn't that long, since I turned 63 this spring. Diabetes, of course, is a risk for many infectious diseases, and this analysis of the literature on the risk of zoster and diabetes suggests that it is a risk for zoster, although the risk varies depending on the study from 1.06 to 2.38. However, it would still be a group that you would want to make sure that they got their vaccine because zoster, shingles, is miserable. In the United States, when I hear Hanta, I think of the Four Corners outbreak, but it's a good reminder that hantaviruses are spread throughout the world. And there is a case report of someone who was in Nepal, went home to Spain, and he picked up a hantavirus infection, the classic pulmonary syndrome. And it was, at least by serologic testing, a Pumala virus. But it's good to remember that hantaviruses are everywhere. Always go with the obvious, right? The article is entitled Heartland Virus Infection in a Heart Transplant Recipient from the Heartland. Like one of those dreary acupuncture articles where the editor feels obligated to put point in the title somewhere. I really think they could have done better. The point being, in the Heartland, you can get Heartland virus even if you're a heart transplant patient. Me, I'd rather be drinking bourbon in the Bourbon County to get the bourbon virus. At least then I'd be having some fun. One of the biggest norovirus outbreaks of all time was in Spain. It infected over 4,100 people and unfortunately was due to contaminated bottled spring water. So drinking that bottled water when you travel may not protect you. But they did use the opportunity to estimate what the infectious dose was of norovirus. Is the 50% illness dose in patients exposed to norovirus. It took only 25 particles if you were exposed to the G1 and 165 if you were exposed to the G2 strain of norovirus. I will point out that as of yet, there are no beer-associated outbreaks of norovirus. And that is actually more viral particles than I had carried in my brain. For some reason, I had it in my brain that the infectious dose of norovirus was 1 viral particle. So it takes a little bit more than that, but not much. Sometimes you get a study that looks interesting in the abstract, and then you read the contents and you know the study is meaningless. They looked at how quickly viral DNA of HIV was suppressed in patients on antiretrovirals and compared those with cannabis use to those without cannabis use or other drugs, and found that patients on cannabis declined their CD4 counts faster. How many people in the cannabis group? 5. And since it was a survey, you don't know if they were actually actively using marijuana at the time. People seem desperate to come up with some medical reason to use cannabis. All I can say is this study does not add to the medical literature in any meaningful way whatsoever, and I don't even know why they published it. But I have no doubt it will be touted as evidence that cannabis use is beneficial in the treatment of HIV. And maybe it is, but you're not going to know it from this piece of... Oh my goodness, look at the Christmas lights. There was an article in Science last week that showed that people who get nasty reviews, and these are anonymous reviews of their research before publications, don't deal well with it. Nasty reviews are detrimental to their mental health. So maybe I shouldn't be so snarky about complete and utter garbage that's published in the medical literature. Somebody's feelings might be hurt. Admit maybe they should just publish better studies. Although the comments quoted in the Science article were certainly inappropriate, even by my standards. I mean, really, what reviewer says something to the nature of, I noticed they had Spanish surnames, so I'm not going to read it because I hate lousy English? What a butthead. I hope I never see a case of Lassa fever. We do have a biologic containment unit in my hospital for the city, so maybe I will someday. But an unknown, to me at least, sequela of Lassa fever is post-viral cerebellar ataxia. And should you be interested, there is a review of the topic in Open Forum Infectious Diseases. And we'll finish off the viral component of this podcast with a note that elephants have a herpes virus, but theirs is much worse than ours. They have a hemorrhagic disease due to elephant endothelial tropic herpes viruses, and it can be found in the elephants of Myanmar. So the next time you're complaining about those painful ulcers, just be thankful you don't have an elephant herpes virus. They did a survey in England, the United Kingdom, looking for tick-borne encephalitis virus, wondering if they had it in their area. And they did find some in deer. The highest proportion, however, was in the Thetford forest, where almost half of deer were positive for tick-borne encephalitis virus. Now you may ask, where is the Thetford forest in the United Kingdom? Well, according to the interwebs, it is the largest lowland pine forest in Britain and is located in a region straddling the north of Suffolk and the south of Norfolk. Isn't that nice? North of Suffolk, south of Norfolk, but not east of Westic. There is no such thing. And it is 47,000 acres, providing habitat for tick-infested and therefore virus-infected deers. I hope to go back to England someday, so I'll at least be wary of that particular part of the country. There are a variety of mycoplasms that are hemotrophic in animals, and there have been occasional case reports of similar mycoplasms in humans, but we don't often test the blood for the DNA of mycoplasms. They did, however, in Japan, in a patient who developed fevers, anemia, and liver dysfunction, and one thing led to another, and they sent off his blood for DNA, and they found Mycoplasma hemohominis in his blood, and he improved on anti-mycoplasm therapy. The other interesting clinical aspects of this patient was he had a rash that covered most of his body. It was pruritic, and it involved his palms and soles, which usually makes one think of syphilis. And you could see it on the peripheral smear where the red cells had small basophilic bodies on the surface of and outside of erythrocytes. I'll take their word for it looking at the photographs. I can never see anything on an H&E stain. Generally speaking, I think of these patients as doxycycline deficiency states, and I usually fret about rickettsia, causing fevers, hematologic anomalies, and hepatitis with no clear reason. But I should probably be adding mycoplasma to the list, especially if anemia is the predominant feature in the febrile illness. A report out of China on the treatment of gonorrhea, where about 10% of their strains had elevated MICs to ceftriaxone. However, those that got high-dose ceftriaxone, 1,000 milligrams or more intravenously rather than the usual piddly 250 IM, had, they say, 0 failure rates in the treatment of gonorrhea. I've noticed that most of the syphilis and gonorrhea literature seems to be coming out of China these days. I guess they're keeping occupied in China. This is not the first time that by pushing the dose of an antibiotic you can overcome some resistance. And I've always wondered if the 250 milligram dose we give people has only been breeding resistance. My theory or my approach to giving antibiotics is you always give the maximal dose for the shortest period of time so that you kill it up front and you don't give it a chance to become resistant. So maybe when treating gonorrhea, more is better. How you phrase things is often important because people will often take the initial language you use at face value. This study looked at the, quote, real-world experience, unquote, of ceftazidime avibactam with a variety of resistant gram-negative rods, and they conclude in their study that, quote, by some measures, treatment appeared to be both effective and safe. Our primary outcome, composite clinical failure, occurred in 29% of patients, and 30-day all-cause mortality was 17.2%. That ain't my definition of effective. My definition of effective is 100% cure rates with no all-cause mortality. If you have bad enough luck to get a CRE/multi-resistant gram-negative rod, you can fully expect that its odds of working are going to be about 2/3, which sucks eggs, but is as good as we got in this day and age. It doesn't stink on ice, but it's hardly great. And I am shocked to see that this article was supported by the folks that make ceftazidime avibactam. So no wonder they call a failure rate of about 1/3 effective. Jesus, doesn't the editors of the journals actually read these papers? I mean, that kind of conclusion shifts from a reasonable assessment of the drug to propaganda. And it's the propaganda that's going to get widely disseminated. Or am I cynical? I don't know. When you think of melioidosis, which is due to Burkholderia pseudomallei, you usually think it's been acquired either in Southeast Asia or Northern Australia. And it's rare in the Americas. Or is it? They did have 12 cases in Panama, and they suggest after evaluation of the epidemiology in that part of the world that we may be seeing an increase in melioidosis in the Americas. But who knows how the epidemiology of some infections is going to change with a combination of human migration and or global warming. I mentioned those cases of Shigella in Navy divers in San Diego. Now there's a case of an acute appendicitis in New York that grew out Shigella species. This is a saltwater organism that had predominantly been reported in warmer waters of the world. Who knows, maybe we'll be seeing more of that organism as well. People still think of antibiotics as big gun or strong or powerful, which, as I have said before, is 100% sensitive and specific that the speaker is an idiot who knows nothing about the treatment of infectious diseases. That being said, my surgical colleagues do love them their carbapenems when people come in with an acute abdomen. And this study looked at the use in people with acute intra-abdominal infections and found that while they had only a 10% rate of resistance in their community, much less here in the Great Pacific Northwest, a full quarter were put on carbapenems plus more when they came in. They may have had a slight decrease in their length of stay. 0.59 days hardly seems impressive, but they also had increase in cost and an increase in complications. And it's been multiple studies to demonstrate that broad-spectrum anti-pseudomonal antibiotics often have long-term downsides like C. difficile, etc. So that it's probably best to get patients off them ASAP, or better yet, not even put the patient on a carbapenem to begin with. There is a lot to be said, I think, for ceftriaxone and metronidazole for virtually every intra-abdominal process in my part of the world. You may have more resistance where you live, but we still don't have a problem with CREs and not that much ESBLs yet. But I suppose that's coming. This next study was out of France, so you have to interpret it in the context of your own epidemiology of diseases. But they looked at the utility of PCR for the diagnosis of bone and joint infections. And they found that by using PCR on the specimens, they increased the yield of the microbiologic diagnosis. Interestingly, in this particular place, they increased the diagnosis of Mycobacterium tuberculosis, something I don't see a lot of here in the Great Pacific Northwest. But they also diagnosed more fastidious organisms and the occasional mycoplasma bone and joint infection. The future of microbiologic diagnosis in infectious diseases really is going to be genetic testing, such as PCRs and that sort of modality. It just needs to become easier and cheaper to do than what we have currently. I mean, the Carious test, which is really cool, costs about $2,000 the last I looked, which is a wee bit much for the average fever coming into the hospital. However, if it was the same price of a blood culture, hey, that would be hog heaven. If you get a Staph aureus bacteremia, what is the chances it's going to seed a prosthetic joint? There was a study years ago in the Annals that addressed this issue, and I never understood their methods. I must have read the article 30 times, and I never understood how they got to the number that they did, which is about 50% as I remember. Subsequent studies have shown a smaller number of Staph aureus bacteremias will actually seed a prosthetic joint. This most recent one, which was published in Open Forum Infectious Diseases, suggests that the rate is about 19%, which is more on par with other studies, which is ballparkish around 1 in 5 or 20% of staph bacteremias will seed a prosthetic joint. So I would say your chance of seeding a prosthetic joint with staph bacteremia is 10 to 20%. Good ballpark figure for your patients. Or your consult note when you see a staph bacteremia in a patient with a prosthetic joint. I always think of the Naked Gun under these circumstances. Quote, he only has a 50-50 chance of living, but only a 10% chance of that. That's sort of how I understand all statistical likelihoods. Statistics, as I've said before, makes my brain hurt. I remember 20, 30 years ago when we looked at antibiotic prescribing for acute cystitis in one of my hospitals. We reviewed all the prescriptions given over a 2-week period for acute cystitis, and not a single prescription was identical. And that boggled my mind. I would think something like cystitis would be very algorithmized, if that is a word, and that the practice and the treatment would be pretty much uniform in the year 2020. Well, this is not true to this day. This study in PLOS One looked at urine cultures in acute cystitis and found wide variation in the utilization of urine cultures to diagnose acute cystitis in physicians. Just like my experience with prescriptions for the treatment of cystitis, they found equally wide variation in the use of cultures, which just boggles my mind. And I suspect we would find similar variability in other very common infections. That, I suppose, is the way of the world, and one of the reasons we will be replaced by machines in the future. If we can't do it right, well, we'll get the computer to do it. Certain bacteremias should make you think of specific underlying issues. Pneumococcal bacteremia, for example, think HIV, or some sort of problems with immunoglobulins, either too little, like CVIDs, or too many, like multiple myeloma. What about Shigella bacteremia? Who gets Shigella bacteremia? Well, older people, African Americans, and more than half of patients with Shigella bacteremia in this study were HIV infected. So if you get a patient with Shigella in their blood, think about the underlying medical problem being HIV disease. This article looked at the association between specific echocardiographic findings and the microbiology of endocarditis. And while not clinically useful per se, I think it is very interesting. They more likely saw aortic valve veggies with enterococcus, with native valves. Mitral valve vegetations were more likely to be associated with streptococci, either group B or viridans, and not unsurprisingly, tricuspid valve endocarditis was Staph aureus and injection drug use. So if you grow a particular bug in the blood cultures, you might be able to predict what the echo anomaly is going to be in advance of the echocardiogram and amaze people. I am a big fan of predicting medical findings. It impresses the hell out of people. MRSA infections peaked about a decade ago. And why? Well, it turns out in this study, it was not due to decline in USA 300 strains. The USA 300 strain is what caused the plague of boils for the last 2 decades with community-acquired MRSA infections. That evidently seems to be holding pretty steady. It was decreases in USA 100 strains of bloodstream infections that has led to the decrease in MRSA that I at least have seen in my practice. But we still haven't figured out a way, short of autoclaving the population, of getting rid of the USA 300 strain. And a nice case of weird epidemiology. Fasciolitis is, of course, the liver fluke and causes liver disease, often due to biliary obstruction. The organism is found throughout the world. There were 2 cases in Belgium where there was a flood which took water from a pasture into a vegetable gardens. People then ate the vegetables and developed the liver fluke, a unique form of the illness. And they point out that if you see a patient with eosinophilia and transaminitis who doesn't have a good reason, at least not a good classical reason for liver flukes, ask them if they've been eating fresh vegetables that have been washed with animal crap. Though there's probably a more erudite way of phrasing that. And I suppose that brings us to an end to this Puscast, a review of the medical literature for the last 2 weeks of December in the year 2019. And as I said, the first Puscast of the year 2020. I think I've been doing this now for 14 years. Amazing. As mentioned at the beginning, the references are available at edgydoc.com, along with links to my multimedia empire. As always, thank you for this most interesting consultation and allowing me to participate in the care of this most difficult and challenging case. I shall continue to follow along with you. Thank you. In dictation, and take it away, Jeffrey.